people in the world today are facing oppression and state violence. It may not look exactly the same, and yet we are bound together. And because we are bound together by the same forces, there are times when we actually can see similarities in our oppressions, for what it's worth. Our enemies, the people who oversee those systems of oppression, are well aware of this fact. They know about our collective entanglement because they do the entangling. And they know that we have a collective interest in our mutual liberation. And they are terrified that more and more of us will discover this. But don't take my word for it. I actually want to quote one of our enemies because I think that it's a really painful illustration, actually, of this consciousness on the part of people who wield power. I want to quote a man some of you may have heard of named Winston Churchill, somebody who is celebrated in the official histories taught in this country and elsewhere in the world, celebrated by historians as a courageous British leader who led his nation during World War II, but was in fact a colonizer who had crystal clarity about the intertwined nature of oppression and of freedom. And I want to ask for your forgiveness before I quote Churchill, not only for quoting this guy, but for what he says. And believe me, I am being selective because the passage that I'm quoting for is so offensive that I'm trying to, go easy on us. So I do think, however, his words are clarifying. This actually comes from an essay. The passage is quoted in an essay by the great leftist Arundhati Roy. She quotes Winston Churchill speaking in 1937 about Palestine and about Palestinians. And he says that he essentially denies the idea that Palestinians have a right to their land. He says, "I do not admit that right. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Indians of America or the Black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly wise race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place." This is Winston Churchill. And Arundhati follows up that passage by saying, that set the trend for the Israeli state's attitude toward the Palestinians. This is Churchill in 1937, before the founding of the state of Israel. But he set a tone that inspired the people who would carry out the founding of that state, and of course, all of the violence that comes with it. We know that the origins of Zionist violence don't start with Churchill, they actually predate it, but you can see that there is an awareness on the part of the people who wield this power of what it means for different groups of people to be oppressed by similar systems, indigenous peoples in the Americas and in Australia and in the Middle East. Now, with that said, I quoted one of our enemies to talk about oppression intertwined, but this panel is called Freedom Intertwined. And so I want to quote one of our freedom fighters who I always take inspiration from, Assata Shakur, in her articulation of how collective freedom is intertwined. Assata Shakur, of course, the amazing Black revolutionary, Black Panther, and author of the autobiography Assata, from which I am going to quote. And I'll just set it up real quick by saying Assata, when she decided to be a revolutionary, she decides to join the Black Panther Party. And she lived in Harlem, but she flew to the Bay Area, to Oakland, because she wanted to meet these Black Panthers and find out about their organizing. But she didn't just want to meet the Panthers. She also went to Alcatraz to see an occupation of that place, a reclaiming of that place by indigenous radicals. And she also wants to meet with the Red Guard, an organization of Chinese American and Chinese revolutionaries in the Bay Area. And so she's trying to find this group of people. She has an address, but she gets lost on the way. She's not from the Bay Area, so she has somebody take her, and they get lost, and they get into this argument, actually, about even going to see the Red Guard. And I'll read what she says. She says, this is about the guy who's taking her around. He couldn't understand why a Black woman wanted to hook up with Chinese revolutionaries in the first place. Ain't nobody gonna free Black folks but Black folks. Those Chinese don't give a damn about you and me. All they care about is their own people and what's going on in China. I told him that I thought there were a whole lot of us in the same predicament, and that the only way we were going to get out of it was to come together and break the chains. The brother looked at me as if I was spouting empty rhetoric. Some of the laws of revolution are so simple, they seem impossible. People think that in order for something to work, it has to be complicated. But a lot of the times, the opposite is true. We usually reach success by putting the simple truths that we know into practice. The basis of any struggle is people coming together to fight against a common enemy. Assata Shakur. So that kind of sense of our common liberation, what we all have to gain from each's liberation and our collective liberation, that's what we're talking about tonight. And with that, I want to go ahead and introduce our really amazing panel. I want to introduce, first of all, Adrian Bonifacio. Adrian is the national chairperson of Anakbayan-USA, a grassroots organization of Filipino youth and students fighting for genuine liberation and democracy in the Philippines. He is also a secretariat member of the International League of People's Struggle Youth Commission, a network of anti-imperialist youth organizations in countries around the world. I want to introduce Jennifer Miller. Jennifer Rose Miller is the co-chair of the Dallas chapter of the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. Growing up in Saudi Arabia, she made deep and long-lasting connections with Palestinians forced to flee their lands due to the brutality of the Israeli occupation, and was quickly able to make the connection between the liberation struggle there and the struggle for Black liberation in the United States. The daughter of a revolutionary in Eritrea, and an American who lived through the brutality of segregation, she has been active in the struggle for self-determination for oppressed nationalities in the US and all over the world since 2016, and is also a full-time mother to a 4-year-old little boy. Melanie Yazzie. Melanie K. Yazzie is Assistant Professor of Native American Studies and American Studies at the University of New Mexico. She specializes in Navajo and American Indian history, political ecology, Indigenous feminisms, queer Indigenous studies, and theories of policing and the state. She also organizes with the Red Nation, a grassroots Native-run organization committed to the liberation of Indigenous people from colonialism and capitalism. Nadia. Nadia is a passionate community organizer and writer, born and raised in the Bay Area, with a focus on refugee rights, transnational justice, youth education, and inter-community empowerment. She sits on the board of the Palestinian Youth Movement North America. And finally, but not least, Niall Fort. Niall is a minister, an activist, and a PhD candidate at Princeton University. So welcome to all of you. And I've got some questions for each of you. I'll read the question and then I'll call on you to respond. And so we'll have some dialogue amongst ourselves, and then we'll have Q&A a little later in the program. So my first question, and it really, it takes off from what I just read, the passage I read from Assata Shakur from her autobiography. It's what histories of resistance do you take inspiration and lessons from as you organize today? We'll start with Nadia.
Thank you, Curry. And that was a brilliant introduction. It's really, really an honor to be here and to speak with all of you, to be in conversation with each other. So as was written in my bio, and kind of just jumping off of the passage from Assata's biography, I'm joining you all from the Bay Area, which is on the unceded land of the Ohlone people, and it's a hub of ongoing struggle for Indigenous sovereignty, for Black power, for third world resistance, and rising up against ongoing dispossession, gentrification, war on the poor, and as well as our people behind bars. Right here in the Bay, in Oakland, I can see 5 different prisons that are really closely located to where we are. So it's important also to note that on the landscape. And I guess I'm gonna jump to that and just say, today, I wanna highlight that it's the 79th anniversary of the US government's executive order to incarcerate 120,000 people of Japanese descent, in which they seize their homes, belongings, and means of production, and then turn them as enemies of the state. And so today, every year, February 19th, the survivors and their descendants hold a day of remembrance And I sit here in the Bay Area, a place of both massive forced removal of Japanese people in the 40s and also their internment in Tanforan in San Francisco and Angel Island. And so I'm inspired today by the efforts of the survivors of internment and their families to publicize the locations of these camps, press for the collective memorializing of their stories and of the brutalization, but also the resistance. And in their best form, narrate against US fascism and highlight the ongoing tenets of repression today. And so I pull that very specifically because I think in the shadow of the executive order that carried out the internment of Japanese people of Japanese ancestry as enemy aliens, it's really important to highlight that much of the legal logic that made the internment of those of Japanese ancestry possible today still exists in public law. And we see remnants of the rhetoric around identity extremism, threats of domestic terrorism being weaponized against our movements. All of us who are organizing here, all of our movements and the movement genealogy that we come from. And so I guess I'm inspired by the knowledge that we are all inheritors of a radical tradition of international solidarity, and that we take seriously the cause of combating US imperialism, colonialism, and fascism from inside the belly of the beast. And so there have been many iterations of solidarity, but I hope that this is a moment, as somebody said earlier, for joint struggle, where we can all build together and fight back and build a very necessary resistance to the challenges of the present. And so, yeah, I take a lot of inspiration from the fact that even 80 years later, there is memorializing and resistance and the highlighting of Japanese American communities to say, look, this happened before, and these same tenets are being used now to repress our movements, and we come from that history. We will stand in solidarity with the people who are going through very similar things, indeed, the oppressions that are materially connected to the things that we went through. That's it.
Beautiful. Thank you, Nadia. Melanie, I wonder what histories and lessons what histories you take inspiration and lessons from when we talk about histories of resistance.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hori, for that beautiful introduction and those quotations to guide us. And Nadia, you know, I agree with everything that you said. And I think for me, you know, I became politicized when I was in graduate school, but it wasn't until I became a serious community organizer about a decade ago. You know, we speak, I think sometimes as organizers, we speak of, you know, what are the material conditions from which struggle emerges? And about a decade ago, the material conditions that radicalized me, you know, I was already reading feminist and queer theory. I was already reading critical race and critical legal studies. And so I had I was informed, right, about theories of power and oppression in some of these histories, but I hadn't really participated, I would say, in movements, kind of boots on the ground. And there was this like popular uprising in the Navajo Nation. I'm a citizen of the Navajo Nation, around a water rights settlement. And I decided, you know, that I really needed to dig in and use my intellectual training to assist my people with trying to understand what was going on. It's essentially a form of legalized theft. It's just, you know, it's a form of colonialism that is enacted through the law. And many people may know in the United States, the law is an instrument of violence. It's an instrument of property and possession, first and foremost. And so that was my beginning entry point into what those histories of resistance looked like. And as a Navajo person, you know, we have long histories of resistance, many of which are led by women. So I've always understood actually my role as a Dene woman in these histories of like Indigenous resistance to be like very important, right? Sometimes we are excluded from other realms of leadership and power, and movements are often the spaces where we can, you know, help to guide our people in these types of struggles. And for my people in particular, that the women have always led us to have a strong understanding of colonialism and capitalism, specifically as it manifests in resource extraction and resource colonialism and extractive capitalism. And so I think we've seen in the last decade, you know, as I've grown up in the movement and I've become more politically developed and radicalized, you know, Indigenous leadership and Indigenous women and youth and LGBTQ2 leadership in the climate justice movement. You know, we saw Standing Rock 4 or 5 years ago was one of the major flare points I can think of in recent history, a very vibrant struggle. And of course, I was telling everyone before this, you know, I was a graduate student at the University of New Mexico in 2009 to 2016. And at that time, Students for Justice in Palestine actually had a very strong chapter at UNM. I myself went to Palestine in 2011. And so what was also happening around the same time was I was also becoming politicized through my understanding of the tradition and the history of the Palestinian liberation struggle. And it really helped me to understand settler colonialism and decolonization and sort of the transnational nature of that in a much more profound way. And Palestine was always at the center of my mind when I was thinking about these traditions of Indigenous resistance, even here in Turtle Island, and even myself as a Navajo person, right? And how we were trying to think through questions of self-determination and decolonization and sovereignty and nationhood. So for me, it's always been a fluid relationship. And since we started the Red Nation, I would say queer and feminist liberation politics, particularly left feminist politics, have been very influential for me. And also too has been third world and left internationalism, and specifically vibrant traditions of anti-imperialism. In the Indigenous movement in Turtle Island, anti-imperialism is still this thing that I think people are still trying to understand. And what is our role as Indigenous folks in the belly of the beast, who actually were some of the very first nations to encounter US imperialism and to resist US imperialism. And that we've been resisting US imperialism since, you know, the Pilgrims touched down on these lands here in Turtle Island. And so how is it that we're informed by these beautiful, strong traditions and revolutionary struggles and national liberation struggles in what is now understood as the global South, and how that informs what we do? So those are the mix, right? It's a mix of those traditions and what we craft out of them as Indigenous people, right? What we craft out of them as nations that desire liberation and freedom. You know, we have a right to the self-determination, and how we determine that freedom based on the coming together of a joint struggle. But of course, we can't do that without coming together as people through struggle. And so that's kind of where I'm at with my own politicization and where the Red Nation is.
Beautiful, thank you. Adrian, I want to ask you what histories of struggle resistance you take inspiration and lessons from.
Yeah, thank you again so much for everyone who's spoken already. A really great introduction. And, you know, I think also back to when I was first getting politicized and organized, I would think I was kind of an apolitical person before joining Anakbayan and all these other things. And, you know, learning about, of course, the Philippines history with imperialism was one of the things that really started to wake me up, right? You know, there was that really enraging quote from Churchill that you read earlier. One of the quotes, thinking back of when I first got politicized, was Rudyard Kipling. Rudyard Kipling wrote The Jungle Book, but he also wrote The White Man's Burden. And The White Man's Burden, you know, that poem that famously starts, you know, take up the white man's burden. And it says all these really terrible things about people of color, and particularly Filipinos, because he wrote that at the time when the US was engaging in the Philippine-American War. And so, you know, that's something that started to really make me question, okay, what is this? What does it mean to be Filipino here in the US, given the nature of the relationship between these two countries, right? Filipino and diaspora in the country that colonized it, right? And so it got me to thinking more about just my own family's history, my own family's positioning in things. You know, my mom, like many other Filipinos here in the United States, was a nurse. And so learning about and thinking about my own upbringing, history, the challenges of living in an immigrant family, the challenges of living in a single parent household. When I started getting politicized, I could start connecting those things more to broader systems of exploitation, of forced migration, of forced diaspora, right? And that's really the entry point where I started learning about the really rich history of revolution in the Philippines, and people trying to make revolutionary change. You know, we're talking about some important dates right now. Next week will be the 35th anniversary of people power in the Philippines, which was when the people came together in the millions to oust a dictator on the streets, Ferdinand Marcos. And people often think of that movement, the people power movement in the Philippines, as just, it happened in 3 days, right? But that was actually decades worth of organizing. And that's something that I think I still appreciate to this day, the painstaking work that needs to be taken up. This year also marks the 50th anniversary of what they called the Diliman Commune, which was based in a university, the main university in the Metro Manila area in the Philippines. They were resisting police and military violence because the students were going on strike for workers and oil price increases. And so taking up, the issues of like the broad masses of folks, right? That's the history that I began to be agitated about. These are folks who barricaded the university down. They took all the engineering students and they commandeered the radio stations to broadcast revolutionary literature. They had some of the other people make like anti-air weaponry to fight back against the police and military. So just like brilliant stories of resistance that I think really grounded me in terms of what does it mean to now be taking up that struggle in the present day, what often in Anakbayan we call an unfinished revolution, something that started with the revolution against Spain at the turn of the 20th century, continued onto the US and continues to this day. But of course, being an activist here in the US, you learn to appreciate so much more about the title of this panel, right? Freedom Intertwined, about the struggles of other people. I know many of the people on this call, I'm very inspired by the work that folks are doing. Learning about the Palestinian struggle, I can even think of, I grew up in Chicago. And so seeing some of the amazing work of like USPCN doing like door-to-door work, really being integrated in the communities. I've had so many conversations with folks in PYM about organizing in diaspora and the challenges and like what are the historical lessons from that, right? And even with folks in the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, we were there at the refounding in 2019 and just seeing the vibrant militancy, especially among youth, right? Bridging that kind of solidarity across movements is a very tangible image in my head of what can solidarity look like and what is a strong foundation for joint struggle moving forward. And so definitely thinking about everyone here in this room, everyone's histories that they're sharing right now, and how those continue to be inspirations for me and many other Filipino activists today.
Beautiful, thank you. Jennifer, what histories of resistance inspire you and do you take lessons from?
Yeah, so first I do also want to thank you. That introduction was beautiful. I love that you talked about Asada. Asada is kind of one of the founding members of the original National Alliance back in the 60s. So I love that you brought her back up and lifted her name up, and everybody who's spoken so far, it's all beautiful. I feel like I have a lot to live up to listening to that, but it really does kind of show me what solidarity really looks like. But to answer your question, some specific, I guess, moments in history that I really take kind of inspiration from and lessons that I draw from are, if I'm going to be honest, really all forms of political, basically uprisings where people have stood up to reject issues and reject certain problems, reject white supremacy, reject colonialism, and also those, but specifically in those instances where groups showed solidarity. So when we're talking about Indigenous resistance to colonialism from like the first time where the pioneers, quote unquote, really colonizers landed here on Turtle Island, and the solidarity that was basically, that was fostered between my ancestors who were stolen from West Africa to come here to work plantations, and the solidarity between these different groups towards fighting against colonialism is one major instance, right? Like, I feel like that's so beautiful because it already then, before Marxist theory was really solidified at all, before Marx was even thought of, people already knew that in order for us to fight our enemy, we do have to come together, and that our common enemy is always going to be white supremacy, colonialism, imperialism. And our ancestors knew that from 1476, right? And then we have further times in our history where we can see this solidarity going on. So if we skip forward another like 300 years, we can look at the forced expulsion of Mexicans from Texas. I live in Texas, for those of you who don't know that. So, and one thing that a lot of our texts and textbooks don't tell us about, and a lot of people don't know, is that after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, all the way up until the 30s and 40s, people who are indigenous to this state have been here for a long time, have been here way longer than the settlers who started moving to Texas, really because the Mexican government allowed them to come here. They were in the middle of the 30s, they were actually rounded up, put into lousing tanks, and actually sprayed down with Zyklon B and other basically chemical agents, a lot of the same chemical agents that were used by Nazis during the time of the Holocaust. And then they were forcibly sent back across the fake border with Mexico to lands that were not theirs, that they didn't know. And there was a lot of resistance to that, and also Black and Mexican solidarity in that point together, right? Because we also, as Black people, were dealing with segregation, being forced into sharecropping jobs, similarly to how Mexicans were treated in Texas. So that's a really important lesson of solidarity right there, right? And then if we skip ahead another 40 years and we're talking about the uprisings for Black liberation in the 50s and 60s, it wasn't just Black people who were standing up. We had the Brown Berets and multiple different indigenous groups, American Indian movement, and multiple different Chicano and indigenous American groups who were also standing in solidarity with African Americans. Same thing with Asian groups who were standing in solidarity with African Americans, because we all understood that even though right now it's happened, like the thing I guess that's blowing up is happening to Black people, this is something that happens to all of us, whether we're here in the United States or we're elsewhere around the world. There were a lot of defectors, Black people who were forced to fight in Vietnam, who then went to Vietnam and defected from the US military. It's something that's kind of hush-hush and not really talked about, but a lot of the messages from Vietnamese soldiers saying, Black person, why are you here? Like, you guys are here treating us the same way that your government treats you back at home. It got to a lot of those soldiers. A lot of them defected. My dad actually was one of those soldiers who, he didn't defect, but he was actually drafted to fight in Vietnam. He actually just turned 71 today. And he talks to me all the time about how a lot of times he would not follow orders. If somebody told him and his very Black unit to go do something that they knew was a war crime, that they knew was illegal, and especially it's coming from a white officer, they didn't do it. They wouldn't. And if anything, they would actually take the time to become friendly with those people, to try to have some kind of connection with them. Like, hey, I know that I'm basically forced to be here because if I don't, I'm going to go to prison. But hey, I see you and you see me. And that's really what's important. And seeing those histories of continued resistance and solidarity between groups that basically capital and the powers that be really want us to see our struggles as distinct and separate from one another, and really don't want us to make the connections that actually the problem that you're dealing with is also white supremacy and really similar to what I'm dealing with. And capital doesn't want us to see that, because then if capital realizes that we see that, then we're going to continue to have power. We're going to continue to build solidarity and build that power. So really just seeing examples of solidarity throughout history up until even last summer is what really inspires me.
Beautiful. We're gonna get to struggles happening today. But first I want to ask my brother Niall, what resistance histories inspire you in your work?
Thank you everyone. I'm just like sort of spellbound listening to you all tell your stories, and I have lots of questions. Hopefully after this we can all talk a little bit more. So I just go back. I grew up in a small Pentecostal church in Newark, New Jersey. It's the kind of church where, you know, the moms would run around and sweat and speak in tongues and fall out, and you throw a little towel over them, you know, and folks didn't have a lot, but they had a lot of love. And so, you know, before I would leave, they would always throw a few dollars in my hand to, you know, go to the corner store to get some fried chicken and douse it in hot sauce and ketchup. And, you know, they would throw me peppermints in my hand. And I keep going back to that. I think I'm going back to it because the theology wasn't good, but the love was real. There was something about that deep, abiding love by those Black women and by those Black folks in that church that it formed the basis of my politics. So it cuts deeper than like what I think about this or that or this political orientation. Before all that, it was the peppermints and the few dollars to get the fried chicken from the corner store. And as I got older, I went to seminary and I began to learn about this person called Jesus that they preached about and sweated over and fell out, you know, in sort of the presence of, and learned that this person was actually a revolutionary, that Jesus was a Palestinian Jew and who was also a revolutionary, who didn't die of old age, as one of my professors, Mark Taylor, says, but who was murdered, who was killed, who was executed, who was lynched, essentially for sparking a revolutionary movement that put people over profit, that created solidarity across class, across religion, across ethnicity, across all of these things. And so in a moment where I'm trying to figure out how to muster the spiritual and the moral wherewithal to deal with this absurdity that cuts to me so much deeper than like my ability to intellectualize it, or my ability to sort of pull on my political resources to understand it from an analysis, you know, that I've learned with my comrades. I go back to that small church and I think about, while they didn't have the best theology, there was a deep abiding love there that has carried me to this point. And to now think about it in light of this long tradition of Black liberation theology, people like James Cone, who made connections between lynched Black bodies swinging on Southern trees and that revolutionary Palestinian Jew who sparked that revolutionary movement, which got him killed. So that's where I'm at, man. I'm really in a place where I'm trying to muster love, the spiritual wherewithal, because on certain days, it's so absurd. I don't want to curse because I'm a minister, I'm not supposed to curse, but I have a lot of bad words to talk about, you know, what it feels like qualitatively. We know the death surge, we know the numbers, but what it feels like to wake up to this bitter earth, as Dinah Washington calls it. So for me, it's that Black liberation theology. It's that small Pentecostal church. It's those Black moms who gave me peppermints and money for fried chicken. And it's the Palestinian Jewish revolutionary named Jesus.
Whew, sounds good. Friday night, it's going down. All right, okay. I got to keep it moving because we got a lot to talk about. There's so much richness here. You know, I could go all night, but we don't have all night. So we're going to do it. So, you know, a bunch of you spoke to actually what's happening today, struggles that are happening today. And this is a time, you know, as Niall said, there's a lot of bad words we could use to describe, you know, what's going on. And I appreciate you invoking how this feels, you know. So there's definitely a lot of oppression and repression taking place. There's also a time of struggle. And I wonder, I want to ask you all, you know, what struggles happening in the world today do you see as important for your work and important for an organization like NSJP to orient on as in the work? So I'll start with you, Nadia.
Yeah, I'll just answer the latter part about NSJP and the students. I think, yeah, the student movement, you know, historically, the student movement has so much power. And not only are you all doing the hard work of building together now in this context, but also taking up the mantle of building with students internationally. I think that there's something very powerful, obviously coming from a youth organization, but there's something powerful about youth organizing, something really powerful about organizing from your campuses and from these institutions that we know often profess great politics, but often are interested in exactly the opposite of liberation. And so I think it's really important to look to the histories and just point to you all. You all are the future of the student movement. You all are the now of the student movement. So, you know, Dr. Lubna Qattami reminded many of us in the Palestinian youth movement at the beginning of February, we were talking about Black History Month. And she reminded us that the General Union of Palestinian Students the 1965 Cairo Conference was entirely dedicated to the question of Palestine and African decolonial struggle. And that really connected from both, Afro and Asian students in the United States, but also back to the continent. And it connected back to South Africa. It connected back to Angola in very particular cases. And so I think, it's a hefty history, but I take a lot of inspiration from knowing that you all are inheriting that, and you're going to do something that is fit for this time. And so where it warms my heart really to see all of us here in this plenary talking about freedom intertwined and the nods to Palestinian struggle. I really feel it. I know that we have a strong internationalist history. And so, I am inspired by the potentials of the student movement today. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Nadia. Melanie, what struggles that are happening in the world today do you want to put on the table, both in terms of what you orient on for your work and what you suggest NSJP orient on?
I'll make it really short because I know we went way long on the first question. I'm sure that many of you know that COVID-19 per capita has hit my people, the Navajo Nation, harder than any other section of the entire country, the so-called United States, over the last year. And I am deeply inspired. It's typically called mutual aid. But, as you were saying, Niall, about like the moms at your church you were growing up and the intense care and the love that they exhibited, and that's the basis of who you are, right? And where your politics come from. I think for me as a Navajo person, just being very inspired by the care and the love, I've started to think about the politics of caretaking that have come out of this context, not just around the COVID-19 in the Navajo Nation amongst my people, but the care of telling their stories, that my tribal newspaper has engaged in, and just thinking about the care work and how that helps us to build an infrastructure, even a different political economy, right? This alternative infrastructure that we need to be building as part of a larger struggle and a project of abolition, really, and decolonization, which is very future oriented. It's one where there's abundance and care and equality, right, and freedom, versus what, the disposability and the abandonment and the intense state of violence and repression that we live under today. And so I just see the caretaking of my own people and of all kinds of people over the last year as deeply inspiring. And it comes from a very heartfelt, not even necessarily a political place, but the political weight and possibility of it, I think, is quite profound. And so I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Melanie. Adrian, what do you want to point to as struggles happening in the world today you want to call attention to for your work and for NSJP?
Yeah, maybe just to start broad, I think just the fight and for us to really be vigilant against counterinsurgency and what that will look like, especially under a Biden administration. I know people will go off about the current political situation in a bit, but it was great to hear that call to action around the very subversive ways that counterinsurgency programs can come into play, like the categorization of Zionism as a violation of Facebook's community standards, right? Those kinds of subversive things, all the way to the very outright violent ways, right? That people can be oppressed, repressed. In the Philippines right now, the issue around counterinsurgency that I'll raise to attention is the Philippine government recently passed what's called an Anti-Terrorism Act last year. And that basically gives the government legal cover to claim any form of dissent as terrorism, right? And it's specifically targeting activists in my organization and many other progressive organizations in the Philippines, but also targeting people abroad. And so it has a clause in there that says that if you are not in the Philippines, but you are engaging in things that are deemed as terrorist acts by the government, they can charge you. And that's if you're Filipino or if you're not Filipino. And so even for folks who might be organizing with NSJP or the other organizations present here, if you show solidarity for the Philippine state has its eyes on you too, right? And this is something that I've been tagged by, government-related Facebook accounts and agencies as a communist terrorist. My fellow organizers have been, other allies at Anakbayan has engaged with have been trolled, doxxed, you name it. And so I think, how can we really come together as organizations in one particular issue area or joint struggle in fighting against the ways that different states are colluding with each other to drive home counterinsurgency tactics under our noses?
Beautiful, thank you. Okay, and Jennifer and Niall have opted to respond to later questions, so we can move on to the next question, which is about the fact that there's been a change in Washington, at least in terms of, some things have changed, some things haven't changed, but one thing that changed is there's new residents in the White House. I guess they're not new, they were there before. Anyway, you know what I'm saying. There's a new president. We also know that our struggles, don't run on the time scales of, the US electoral calendar. But we know that these changes impact what happened to people, in this place and around the world, and they impact our struggles. So I wanted to ask a question, and I'll start with Nadia, just about, how do you think the change in Washington will impact our movements or not? And how are you kind of orienting in this moment to the changes at the top?
Yeah, I think, it's a really good question. I know that this Biden-Harris administration will remain an obstacle to the Palestinian people in our struggle for liberation. And, read the executive orders that Biden signed at the beginning of his presidency, such as the removal of the Muslim ban, which is going to make a big difference for us here and our families in the MENA region, and also the end of officially family separations at the US-Mexico border, which will make a big material impact for migrating families. I don't want to get caught up in the feel-good promises of this administration because they're going to be largely cosmetic changes, not deep-rooted policy changes, unless we push for them ourselves. And I really think that, as Adrian, you just mentioned, we are seeing the consolidation of some of the things that Republicans and Democrats both wholeheartedly agree on. So the counterinsurgency is one, Israel, war, and of course, surveillance and policing domestically. And so, while Trump attempted to obliterate any semblance of Palestinian self-determination, the defunding of UNRWA, the criminalization of BDS, the relocation of the US Embassy to Jerusalem as the seat for aggressive annexation, we really have to reject the Biden admin's recognition of the US Embassy in Jerusalem, its commitment to the Consul of Israel, with Israel on all regional issues, and the course of the ongoing $3.8 billion in military funding to Israel, which has not stopped. And so I really expect that Biden will work to pacify the Palestinian liberation movement. An example, a return to a peace process that has and will isolate and neutralize Palestinian self-determination by design is not any standard that we want to return to. Whether it's brokered by Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, we don't want it. And so my orientation to Washington is a very practical one. I don't have hope in elected politicians, but I do have hope in us as a people's movement to push for the changes that we need. Yeah, that's just the start. I'd love to hear what others have to say.
Beautiful. Melanie, what do you think? How are you orienting on what's going on in Washington at the moment?
Yeah, I'll also make it really brief because I know we're close to time. And this also, I think, bleeds into the next question, which is about the January 6th Capitol Hill thing. But seriously, I felt like January 6th was Settlers Gone Wild on the right. And then I felt like January 21st was Settlers Gone Wild on the left. Okay. Like it was like miraculous the way in which white settler ontology, right, in the United States is resilient AF, and that there was such a deep sense of fear and threat because really, I mean, really the last decade, you know, and especially the last year in the so-called United States, it's been like militant Black and Indigenous power, right, that I think has really threatened, you know, the stability of the US settler state. And so I'm seeing like what's happening in Washington is like a circling of the proverbial wagons, to use a nice settler frontier metaphor. And that whiteness is like doubling down in this moment within that settler ontology. And I just think Black and Indigenous folks just need to keep like building militant power and like not really giving like, you know, a fuck about what's happening in Washington, because I really believe it's our struggles coming together, especially here in these lands, that really form a strong foundation to undo, you know, just like the project of settler colonialism and white supremacy. So that's why I'm reading it. I just want to keep building struggle personally. So.
Word, thank you, Melanie. Adrian, how are you orienting on the changes in Washington at the moment, or what's going on in Washington at the moment?
Yeah, all I'll say is that under the Obama-Biden administration, they passed one of the worst military agreements in recent history in the Philippines that allowed for unlimited basing all over the country. And so I don't have much hope. Defense Secretary Austin just recently met with the defense secretary in the Philippines also to reinforce the military agreements between the two countries, which have always been oppressive. And so I ditto everyone else. It's really in the people that will find hope and the power for change. And at the silver lining with the election is that, you know, millions mobilized to take action. They took action through the vote, but there's so many more ways that we can teach people to take action as well.
Thank you. And Niall, what about you? How are you making sense of what's going on in Washington, and how are you orienting?
Well, when it first happened, you know, I'm not gonna lie, I was really happy when Donald Trump got out of office. I was very happy. I was electric sliding through my apartment, and I was very happy because he lost, but I was not happy that Biden won. And so I was crystal clear about that. And so that's kind of my orientation generally. You know, I think everything that everyone else said. I think the question for me, and it's more sort of a movement theory question, is not so much what impact Washington will have on the movement, but what impact the movement will have on Washington. And so I think that the beautiful thing about social movements is that it changes the terrain of what's possible. So even what's possible in terms of what can be said at a presidential debate, you know, changes because the movement sort of pushes people to be able to talk about certain things that were formerly unsayable in the sort of mainstream. So I'm extremely excited and optimistic about the value that social movements have on this particular moment, and extremely pessimistic about the sort of potential of, as Nadia said, elected politicians.
Word. Thank you. Thank you all. And I'll just say Jennifer has opted to take the night off from answering questions about Biden just for tonight, but that's okay because we're about to hear her wisdom in response to my next question, which, as Melanie previewed, is actually about the far right. I mean, settlers gone wild is definitely an apt description. You know, the attack on the Capitol on January 6th was a marker in terms of the boldness of the far right in the US. And yeah, the response, I'll say, has definitely been troubling. I've definitely been troubled by, which is the mobilization of the National Guard. They put 25,000 troops in DC. And more policing. They're talking about more anti-terror laws, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So my question is, how does an emboldened far right impact the struggle or struggles that you're involved in? And how do you think we should be responding? And I want to start with you, Jennifer.
So what I will say is that the thing about the Trump presidency and Trumpism generally is that it's a fascist ideology. Point blank period. I feel like a lot of people, especially a lot of leftists who I do genuinely consider comrades, and I'm a leftist as well, kind of make the mistake of saying that anything that isn't left is automatically fascist. And I think that that is just incorrect. It's just wrong, right? A neoliberal is a neoliberal, and a fascist is a fascist. And a fascist wants to gas you, and a neoliberal wants to maybe dispossess your people, but they're not necessarily interested in outright gassing you and doing ethnic cleansing and genocide, right? At least on a very express violent level. Like, not to say that the policies of neoliberalism aren't damaging. They are, but they're not fascist, right? So Donald Trump and his ideology was fascist, period. So there's a genie that's just out of the bottle. You can't put it back. Now these people have been further emboldened to do exactly what they did on January 6th, and really what they've been doing for the past 4 years. If we look at statistics from the FBI, we see that when Donald Trump became president, there was an exponential increase in hate crimes against people of color, against LGBTQ people. This is a genie that can't be put back in the bottle. For us here down in Dallas, we actually were planning to hold a rally at a Confederate War Memorial that was still up. And it was the only reason why, according to the city of Dallas, that they still had it up was because there was, well, really it's because the governor, Governor Abbott had, which I'm sure, especially after how you guys have seen how the state of Texas has handled this, I just had my power come on yesterday. From Monday, I was like bouncing between friends' places and warming stations because, like, you know, it dropped so low in my house that I could see me and my son's breath in the air inside. It was like 40 degrees, and I was like, I gotta get us out or we're gonna like freeze in here. So, but with that being said, you know, the governor had basically done an injunction to stop the city from removing that Confederate statue. So we decided, okay, we're going to have a protest there anyway. And this is the same time during the uprisings this past summer where there was a lot of action surrounding Confederate war memorials and people just tearing them down. And obviously, our intention was not for anybody to tear it down. But if that happened, that happened. You know, I wasn't going to personally do it, but when we had set our event for that, a local neo-Confederate chapter shared the event, posted about it all over their Facebook page, and basically really, because I mean, if you're getting a message or not, if your event is being shared by local right-wingers, neo-Nazis, neo-Confederates, that's a threat. You know, they don't have to explicitly say anything to you, but it's a threat that they're going to be there. And if you know that those entities are going to be there, it's very likely that people will be shot. So last second, we had to change the location of our event to a different park, like about 5 miles away, which caused a lot of confusion because, like, at first they were like, oh, they changed the event. Like, are they really going to be there? Are they not? Whatever. So, but we did really end up changing it. And I was speaking to a journalist who was interviewing me at our new location, at our new protest location. And he was like, you guys made the right decision to move, because we have some people down there and there's about 15 people there that are very heavily armed. And it's like, you know, a lot of that is really just them carrying guns to be intimidating, but I'm not going to walk people into an ambush. And even, you know, when the police attacked our protests and people were being hurt left and right, I felt personally responsible for that. So I knew I wouldn't be able to live with myself if somebody had gotten shot. So, you know, at that point we had to move. At other protests down here in Texas, there were actual like neo-Nazis who have been identified as neo-Nazis because they were in Charlottesville at the Unite the Right rally in 2017 who were stabbing folks. And it was even smaller protests in like little country towns, you know what I mean, that were stabbing people. So we can already see that these right-wingers have been very much emboldened. So what that means for us, especially as Black organizers, is that we really have to, for one, don't be afraid of these people, because I mean, I'm sure for a lot of us, when we were watching what happened at the Capitol, we were like, wow, these fascists seem powerful and they are emboldened and they basically have the free reign of the state to do whatever, because we watched police officers like take selfies with them and open doors for them and open barricades and let them in, right? So, but at the same time, let's remember what happened to a lot of these people. A lot of them were trampled, okay? A lot of them were listening to when that woman was shot and killed, they heard a gunshot and thought it was a flashbang. So these people are not that intelligent, they're not that well organized, and they're just not anything really to be that fearful of. They carry big weapons, but they're not necessarily as scary as they like to pretend that they are. Mao has a really good quote where he says, US imperialism is a paper tiger. And it's really actually very easy to, and what he's saying by that is that it's very easy to destroy. It just comes off as so much more powerful than it really is. And that's one thing that we need to understand. These fascists have just been emboldened, but they're not necessarily as powerful as they're making themselves be. All we have to do is continue to do the work that our people have already been doing for over 400 years on this colonized, occupied land that we now call the United States, and continue to do that work. Because at the end of the day, you know, I'm sure a lot of the people when the Haitian Revolution started out were terrified of the French government, but Haiti brought the French government to its knees. And I don't see why we don't have the same power to do the same. We just have to remember, especially now, seeing how, like, it just gives more proof to the often made argument by a lot of leftists that the police and right-wingers like collude with one another. This just gives more proof to that evidence. So we just have to remember, like, not only are we going to be coming against these groups, but we're also coming against state forces as well that are in collusion with these organizations.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm going to go to Melanie next. This question about the far right, how it impacts your work, and what you think we need to be doing.
Yeah, so I'll try to be quick again. We had very similar experiences here in New Mexico last summer. It was the New Mexico Civil Guard, which was a far-right militia, made national news several times. We were at the protest trying to take down a conquistador statue where a fascist shot one of our friends and fellow organizers right in front of us. And so we did a lot of support work for that individual. They also doxed my partner and I and tried to bring a lynch mob to our house and also to my workplace at the university. So we have like very intimate experience, I think, dealing with the fascists at this point. And it was important for us to realize that as a revolutionary, an Indigenous revolutionary organization, it was actually very important that we had very strong, uncompromising anti-fascist politics and that we supported that work, regardless of who was doing that work on the ground this summer. That said, I do a lot of work on police violence. I forgot to say this, you know, that also one of the genealogies of struggle that I come from, but that also the Red Nation comes from, is Red Power. And Red Power was founded in Minneapolis, right, in the 1960s, doing community patrols because of the extreme police violence and repression against Native working class and poor people living in those neighborhoods. And so here in Albuquerque, we have long traditions of anti-police brutality movements. Police violence in Albuquerque is some of the worst in the country when it comes to like city numbers per capita. And so I do a lot of work on fascism and the continuum of sort of fascist aesthetics between like cops and military, and then these militias, and then also vigilantes, white supremacists of other kinds, right, who are engaged in this type of behavior. And what I've noticed is that the far right has actually co-opted and molded a type of neoliberal injury politics, this like notion of trauma that I think the left, and the liberal left particularly, also participates in a lot. And they've created it, you know, into an identity of like threat, right? Where they always feel threatened, where their whiteness and their masculinity is always feeling threatened. And they talk about it through this injury lens. And and something that the right has done, I think, really effectively is that they've actually read the way that the left engages in politics, and they've either replicated it or they've molded it into something in their own. Because neoliberalism doesn't just affect liberals, right? It is also something in the way that trauma and the injury politics under neoliberalism has really transformed like our political expressions and ideological expressions across the political spectrum. And so something that I've been thinking, this is an unformed thought because I'm still very much thinking through this and working on it in a book, that I think there's something about injury and that's like this politics of trauma that we need to be much more critical of on the left, because seeing the way that it functions on the right to like justify this like very extreme form of violence across an entire, the relationships between the state and vigilantes is something that is very troubling to me, right? And so it's like, how do we not continue to participate in this either? because it seems to be some sort of continuation of a politics that allows kind of like the status quo to continue. And so those are just, again, unformed thoughts, but this is just kind of how I'm reading what's happening on the far right.
Ooh, excellent. Thank you so much. So much to say here. Nadia, what about you? What are you thinking about the far right, its impact on your work and our collective work?
Yeah, just thinking about what Melanie and Jennifer just said, and how many ways we can approach this question. And I think for me, I think about the far right impacts. I guess I'll answer it in this way. I think about the domestic terrorism policy expansion, the proposed expansion that Biden and Harris are putting forward. And, you know, it does include a required assessment of the domestic terrorism threat posed by white supremacists and neo-Nazis, including local law enforcement agencies and uniformed services. But I'm saying that because that's the only positive thing I can say about it. I believe that we really need to keep our eyes on the fact that it also pushes to legally consolidate the legitimate discontent of Black, Brown, Indigenous, Muslim, Arab communities with racist right-wing fascist extremism. It equates right-wing and left-wing as both extremist. And so I really think we need to be wise in the assessment that a US state-sanctioned crackdown against domestic terrorism will always be weaponized primarily against movements working for people power. It's always it's a crackdown on state-sanctioned terrorism, or excuse me, a crackdown on domestic terrorism will never condemn the violence of the state that's perpetrating violence against us, nor will it infringe the supremacist movements that uphold the state's interest to curtail our movements. So I just think some of the responses in the discourse that I've seen online around the expansion of this policy, I want to encourage us to think of dismantling the rhetoric and the policies around terrorism and counterterrorism frameworks, not like expanding them and trying to apply them to neo-Nazis, because as someone organizing from Palestinian, Muslim, and immigrant communities, I know exactly where those policies end up, and it's not going to be at the white supremacists. It's going to, that is, again, pretty rhetoric for the Democrats, but it's going to come right back to us, and it's going to come right back to all of our movements, Indigenous, Black, Filipino, any of our movements that are going up against the state. That's one of the main things I've been thinking about.
So much goodness on this panel, and just appreciating all of your insights and the really important experiences that Jennifer and Melanie talked about in terms of like dealing with the far right as well. This question of the sort of efforts to use a counterterrorism discourse against fascism. I'm so glad that Nadia put that on the table. I hope and I imagine that's something that we'll be talking about throughout the weekend. I want to go to Adrian. What are you thinking about the far right and how it impacts our work and your work?
I don't have too much more to add. I just ditto what everyone else said. I think Mal had something to say in response to Nadia.
Yeah. It was making me think like how deep and expansive is the abolitionist demand and politic and vision. So, prisons aren't going to fix poverty, capitalist exploitation. You shouldn't lock Black people up who are poor and right. But we shouldn't lock up white supremacists either, because these prisons breed white supremacy. It's only going to do a great job at making them more angry, more white supremacists. And so I think there's also a question of this is going to disproportionately impact Black folks, Indigenous people, poor people, the most vulnerable. It's also going to actually embolden white supremacists more by locking them in a place where your choices are, you go with the Bloods, you go with the Crips, you go with the Muslims, the Nation of Islam, or you go with the white supremacists. Like you actually choose between who you're going to be in solidarity with in prison. And so I think just thinking about you know, that reality of what it actually means for the response to white supremacy is to put them in a institution that literally breeds white supremacy, like explicitly, not just like on a sort of undergirding the institution, but like explicit units of white supremacists that breed that. So I think that's one. When I saw the January 6th attack, a part of me was like, oh, wow, like white America is really, really scared. They're very afraid. And it made me think of Cedric Robinson. And I know Cedric Robinson's, you know, racial capitalism has become extremely popular. A friend of mine, Matt Harris, who I went to seminary with, always reminds me, he's like, you know, racial capitalism isn't actually the heart of Cedric Robinson's work. The heart of Cedric Robinson's work is the fact that racial regimes are not invincible. That these racial regimes, these systems of oppression are constantly trying to reinvent themselves, you know, because they know that they're breakable, they're not invincible. And so what I saw on January 6th was a dramatic expression of the fear of white America. And so that instilled something in me to let me know that, oh, wow, like we're doing something right, because this is what this is. This is sort of an expression of the deep fear that the country no longer belongs to them, that the country no longer belongs to them. And so I was actually deeply proud of us for instilling that kind of fear. It is also nerve-wracking, though, the liberal response to these kind of attack, you know, and I don't have to go into it because we already talked about it, is that liberal racism gets a pass. You know, so thinking about what Fred Moten says when he says policy kills more people than police. And so, you know, Derek Purnell, my partner, wrote an amazing article in The Guardian just about this. We should be more scared about what's happening inside the Capitol than what was happening outside the Capitol on January 6th. We should be scared about the policies that they're creating every single day that ends up killing more people, wreaking more havoc, and actually devastating communities of color and poor people across the globe in very insidious, quiet ways every day. And so that's the other thing. The last thing I'll say is, and I think this is a general sort of thing in movements that I've noticed, and I've done this a lot. It's like when people don't get it right away, sometimes we dismiss them. It's like, oh, you don't get it. You know, this is just liberal, you know. Well, at some point, it's like, if that was the response to me, then I would have never become a radical. I would have never entered the Black radical tradition, because that was me at one point. And so I do think that as those of us who stand in the radical tradition, the question is not feeling good about being right about the wrongness of the world, not feeling good about being right about the wrongness of the world, but actually feeling good about transforming the world itself, which in part means I understand that that's your response. I was there, my family members are there, I get that. How do we use this as an opportunity to move people to the left, to actually use political education, to actually use all of our resources as this opportunity, not just to say, oh, here go the liberals again. Now, some of them are not operating in good faith, and not all of us are called to talk to everybody. But I do think that we have to take these moments as remarkable opportunities to transform people's minds and give them pathways to join the movement, you know?
Woo, wow, okay. You know, once again, look, listen, here's the bad, I got bad news, I got good news. The bad news is that we're coming to the end of this session. The good news is this is the beginning of a weekend of conversation. So we're gonna keep it going. I do want to highlight, man, of all of the public conversation taking place right now, you know, in the news and elsewhere about responding to these fascists and responding to fascism and the use of the criminal justice system to deal with that, I have not heard the point about prisons as a site for breeding white supremacy, not only in terms of the incarceration, the carceral system, but the actual prisons as a site for recruiting to fascist movements. So thank you so much for that, Niall. And thank you all who've all been thinking about this in really, really important ways. And I think that we put together some amazing pieces that point to what we need to, how to kind of navigate this wild situation we're in. So with that said, I want to ask the last question of the evening, and it's really a return to the question of Palestinian freedom and how we are organizing for that. And I'm holding on to what one of the things that Niall also said, that was me at one point, the person who at first who's in a different place politically, who didn't see things the way that I do now. We've had conversations with those folks, but that was us, at one point. And so thinking about how we are organizing to build solidarity in this place with the Palestinian freedom struggle, that is really to everybody, to those who are already, are clued into what's happening in Palestine, and those who are just getting clued in. How do we do that work? That's really what my last question is about. And so we know that a long-time feature of the Palestinian freedom struggle is the recognition that Palestinian freedom is bound up with the freedom and struggles of other oppressed people. I want to be clear that we should not be, just because Palestinian freedom is inextricably intertwined with the freedoms of so many other peoples, that's not the basis, in my opinion, for being in solidarity with Palestine. I'm for a free Palestine, you know what I mean? Whether or not, regardless of the extent to which the Palestinian movement is at the moment, you know what I mean, invested in the question of Black freedom. I want Palestine to be free because Palestinians deserve to be free, right? Now, that said, it's important in its own right, and it is also inextricably linked with the freedom of all oppressed people. And what I want to ask is, as we're organizing for freedom, what would you say is the relevance for Palestinian liberation to the struggle that you're involved with, and for the whole world, really? What is the relevance of where does the struggle for a free Palestine fit in terms of the freedom of oppressed people all around the world? So I want to ask that question. I want to give the last word to Melanie.
I have to take off soon, a little bit preemptively, so I apologize. I would really love to continue this conversation later. I feel like we just got fired up and now we have to stop it. But Huri, thank you so much for saying that. Like, first of all, like, I just want Palestine to be free, period. Like, I don't need that to be necessarily intertwined with the freedom of my own people, Like, I know why this is important and why I'm here. I know why, I'm donning this keffiyeh around my neck. I know what it means, and it's an honor and it's a real responsibility, to fight for Palestinian people in every way that we possibly can. That being said, I think you already said it, Huri, that I think the Palestinian liberation struggle teaches us about solidarity. It's actually one of the struggles that has solidarity built and internationalism built into their national liberation and struggle for decolonization. It teaches us so much about how self-determination is only achievable through international solidarity, right? That there's a relationship between the two. And so I think the enduring lesson of Palestine within our struggles, as Indigenous people in Turtle Island, will always be about the question and the practice of solidarity as the basis of our national liberation struggle and our self-determination as Indigenous people. And we're deeply indebted to Palestinian people for charting that alternative path towards national liberation for us historically.
Beautiful, thank you so much. Let me pass it to Nadia. What is the relevance of the Palestinian freedom struggle for a free, a world of freedom struggles?
Oof. I mean, it's just, I'm really humbled. Joint struggle work and doing this work with you all is humbling. It is deeply meaningful to me. And I think, for me, as coming from an organization that tries to bring together Palestinian youth in exile and diaspora, the point for me is that Palestine is not just a feeling or a word. It's not just a cultural identity, it's a political responsibility. We are the ones who are going to carry our freedom home, right? We are the ones who liberation lives within. I know we often say, we often quote our enemies as well, right? The old will young and the old will die and the young will forget. We know that our ancestors are with us, and the old don't die, they continue to live with us. We are also carrying them forward. There is something really important about memory and the resilience of memory, and taking that and not just imagining future, but imagining our resistance. How are we going to get free? And it means a lot, Melanie, when you say recognizing the internationalist nature of Palestinian struggle. I didn't understand that as a young person. I felt it and I knew it, but I'm deeply indebted to that history for myself, and it made me think about other internationalist struggles. But that's actually not where I started. I started, of course, I've always been Palestinian, but I'm born and raised here in the Bay Area. And there was only one other Palestinian in my school, and she was my cousin. So the people who taught me were immigrant people. They were Black people, they were Native people who were here and taught me more about who I was, and that I cycled that back to inform also who I am as a Palestinian. So I say that to say that I'm also indebted to the struggles that you all come from, that we must carry forward, because in the grounding as a child in exile, they taught me first who I was and helped me understand the political responsibility and connections. So much like you said, Niall, the feelings and the love and the family who raised me, they taught me the heart of being Palestinian. I think I understand the political responsibility and what it means to be in joint struggle and what it means to fight because of the histories that I've inherited here from the Black Power movement, from the Indigenous sovereignty movement, and from the Third World Liberation Front, and ongoing movement. And so, yeah, shout out to y'all and the real vibrancy and courage that we take from being in solidarity with you all.
Wow, thank you. I want to move it to Adrian. What do you think is the relevance of the Palestinian freedom struggle for your work and for the world?
Yeah, I'm just taking in all these really amazing responses. To quote not me, but to quote a revolutionary this time, to leave it on a good note. There was a student activist in the 70s and 80s in the Philippines. His name's Leon Alejandro, and he said that the struggle for freedom is the next best thing to actually being free. And so I think that,
Sorry, I didn't realize I was unmuted. I was just reacting. I'm sorry. Let me mute myself, but wow, whoa. Okay.
Yeah, and so, I think about that quote because we can't underestimate the power that comes with seeing another people, people who are exploited and oppressed by enemies that just seem larger than life, that seem undefeatable. Seeing those people struggle so decisively for their freedom. And so I think, personally speaking, right? I mean, what Nadia said about learning about politics from another people's struggle and then reflecting that back to themselves, I can say the same thing about learning about the Palestinian struggle for self-determination, learning about people like Leila Khaled, like Rasmia Ode, the countless other names of organizers, fighters, martyrs, and even people who organize to this day, Anakbayan members, myself personally, working alongside folks in PYM, in NSJP, USPCN, within our lifetime, and there are so many other Palestinian liberation organizations that have taught me what does it mean to, going back to what Niall said, what does it mean to do that painstaking work of organizing people, of not talking above people, but taking the time, going door to door, having meals with folks, building real community, and then transforming that into revolutionary action. How do I learn about what it means for myself as a Filipino in diaspora? What does that even mean, right? What does it mean to not know fully a country that none of my community wanted to leave, right? And what does it mean about the responsibility to fight for it, right? To want to be able to have a place and have a role in seeing myself back in a motherland, right? And so I think all these things are things that I have also learned just from learning from and organizing alongside the Palestinian liberation movement. And so I think there's so much that can be said about what a world with a free Palestine could mean. So much revolutionary potential, and we can already see it, even if that we know that freedom is still a little bit more on the horizon, because that struggle for freedom itself is a liberating thing.
Thank you, Adrian. I want to turn it to you, Jennifer. What do you see as the relevance for the Palestinian freedom struggle for your work and for the work of all people working to get free?
Sorry, I was having a little bit of trouble unmuting myself there. So first, I do want to say everything that everyone has said has been so beautiful. Thank God I didn't accidentally unmute myself, because I was definitely getting teary and having to make sure I didn't start weeping openly, especially listening to you, Nadia. It was beautiful. So if we're going to talk about anything specific, then we really need to talk about the brutality of the IDF towards the Palestinians and how the same tactics of knee on neck, extrajudicial killings, and other similar tactics and policing methods are also used here. Police officers in the United States go to Israel to train. Actually, the police officer who killed, who's mainly blamed for killing George Floyd, Derek Chauvin, he was trained by IDF soldiers. So if we're going to talk about policing in the United States, then we need to, it's imperative that we talk about the Palestinian struggle. It's important. They're bound up in one another in a way where it's not just this ideological idea where, our freedom is bound up in one another, but it's literally bound up in one another, right? These tactics are the same that they're using by IDF soldiers in Palestine, are the same that the police officers are using here. So it's, I gave a talk a couple months ago, and I said the only way that you can actually believe in the tenets of Black liberation is that you also believe in Palestinian liberation, that you also fight for that and struggle for that as well. Because if not, then it's kind of what are you doing? You can't get there. You can't get there. And then also, just even besides that, when we're talking about larger movements around the world, it's so important that we, again, Melanie has spoken about, and that Nadia has alluded to a lot of times in her talking on this panel, is that we do recognize that the internationalist roots in the Palestinian movement and in the fight for liberation that's been happening for so long. I mean, if we're going to talk about just the type of how our liberation is bound up in one another, it's very important that we talk about these internationalist struggles that we're all dealing with, because ultimately our not necessarily unique, but our common goal and our common enemy is white supremacy, is capital, right? These are the things that are holding us down as people. So I feel it's very important that we keep these things in mind, and that we always are making those larger links and connections. There are people who are going to be confused when they first hear these things, like Niall was alluding to. There are people who are not going to understand. But I feel part of our job as revolutionaries and as radicals is to get people to understand. We can't just say Google is free, Google it, because I mean, none of us would be where we are if somebody didn't take the time to sit down and talk to us and tell us what's going on, and to educate us. And even when we pushed back, they responded with an answer. And even if we pushed back and that conversation ended terribly, it got the wheels turning, and we are where we are now. You know what I mean? So I feel it's so important that we just kind of think about that, and we always put that away, because it's just not helpful to anybody. And knowledge is something that is all of our birthright. And if you have the ability to provide it, you need to do, especially if you're in this kind of work, it's your job to do it. It may be terrifying, it may be so frustrating, it's annoying, I understand. But so much of life is frustrating and annoying that, you know what, you still got to get up and do the work. So get up and do the work.
Beautiful, man. Listen to the wisdom of these organizers, it's a reminder that this weekend is not just for us as we participate, it's for us to be better set up to go out and organize other people, right? And at the end of the day, it's about doing our part in terms of the Palestinian freedom struggle. Thank you for that, Jennifer. And I'm gonna kick it to Niall for the last word.
I mean, just to reiterate a lot of what folks said, my understanding of the best of the Black freedom struggle in the United States is that it's always been an internationalist struggle. In the heyday of slavery, the Haitian Revolution sent shockwaves through the Americas. You had slave insurrectionists like Denmark Vesey, who was from the Caribbean, who was translating French newspapers to fellow enslaved Africans, inspiring and inciting them to rise up and break the back of slavery on the mainland. I mean, you look at someone like Ella Baker, who was organizing in the 1920s and 1930s around and standing in solidarity with Ethiopia over and against Italy. She never even left the United States, but still had a deep sense that it was important to fight against Italian imperialism and stand in solidarity with Ethiopia. Ella Baker. You look at, of course, the 1960s movements. They didn't kill Dr. King because he had a dream. They killed Dr. King because he had a plan to eradicate poverty and to end the war in Vietnam. They didn't oust W.E.B. Du Bois simply because he started the NAACP. It's because he became a Black communist and began to make connections between empire, class, race, and all these things. You look at the anti-apartheid movement in the 70s and 80s and how many student activists end up becoming very pivotal to the struggles here in the United States through the anti-apartheid movement. So I think one is just sort of honoring and joining up in and carrying on that long legacy of internationalist struggle that we have here in the United States. And I just sort of will end with what Robin Kelly said, and to reiterate what a lot of folks said, I don't stand in solidarity with Palestine because I have a shared sense of oppression. I stand in solidarity with Palestine because I have a shared sense of freedom struggle, because I understand that their freedom is bound up in mine, right? And so I think that is so important to recognize exactly what everybody's saying. Why is it relevant? Because their lives are precious. That's it. Because I deeply believe, going back to that Black church, that every single human being has a fundamental dignity, and we should fight for that regardless. And so, thank you again for what everyone said. I agree with everyone. There's so much more to be said, so I hope we can talk more. And that's all I gotta say.
Thank you all so much for just the richness and the generosity of this panel. And just what I heard was such it was such an articulation of not only how we become better fighters, better freedom fighters, but this is such an invitation to see how we ourselves grow and become who we are, become our best selves, in the context of these struggles. And I so appreciate your narratives, you're narrating your own experiences and how you came into your own. And I know that this weekend will be more of that for those of us participating in all of that. So it's an invitation, enjoy it, enjoy the richness, but we also need to remember at the end of the day, what we're doing this weekend is so much bigger than us as individuals, right? At the end of the day, this is about people getting free, and in particular, about Palestine getting free. And for those of us organizing in this place, we are located in a place where our struggle plays a particular role in that freedom struggle, where we have things to contribute and crucially, things to learn. So thank you all so much. We're going to have a fantastic weekend. Shout out to everybody for participating. Shout out to my panelists. Everybody stay safe, wear a mask, free Palestine. Peace.
Thank y'all. Thank you. Y'all take care.
Thank you, Curry.
Yes. Take care, everybody.